Don't die. You hear me, don't you dare die. Rain hammered down on the docks like the sky had split open. Jolene Calloway dragged the nearly 200-pound body of a stranger across wet concrete. Both hands locked onto the collar of his vest, pulling him toward her truck parked almost 100 meters away. Her shoulders screamed. Her boots kept slipping in the puddles. Every step she pulled, her whole body shook from the effort. Blood from the wound on his side thinned out in the rain and trailed behind her feet. Jo clenched her jaw, threw every ounce of strength into one more step, then one more. Her knees cracked against concrete, sharp pain shot through her, but her hands never let go. She didn't know who he was, didn't know his name, didn't know why he was lying here with a long gash across his ribs and blood soaking through his shirt. She only knew one thing: if she walked away, this man would be dead before sunrise. And Jolene Calloway, the girl the entire city of Redmore called everything from the fat one to that woman who drives trucks, the girl no man ever bothered to look twice at, was risking her life in the middle of a design rainstorm for a complete stranger. What she didn't know was the unconscious man beneath her grip was Barrett Thornton, the most powerful crime lord on the east side of the docks, and that night would change her fate forever. But before you find out where that night took Jo, stay with this story, because you need to understand what she survived to become the kind of person who would risk everything for a stranger in the pouring rain. If you want to find out where Jo and Barrett's story goes from here, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if this is your first time here, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Jolene Calloway was 18 years old when she first understood what it meant to lose the most important thing in the world. Her mother lay in a bed at Redmore Hospital for 3 long months, her body growing thinner day by day, like a candle burning down to its final bit of wax. The cancer gave her no chance. Jo sat beside her mother's bed on that last afternoon, holding her hand tightly, feeling the warmth slip away little by little. The room was so quiet that Jo could hear the heart monitor beeping steadily, then slowly fading. Her mother opened her eyes and looked at her daughter, her voice so weak that Jo had to bend close just to hear her. "You're stronger than you think, Jo." Then she closed her eyes. The hand in Jo's hand slowly went cold. The sound of the machine stretched into one straight line. Jo didn't cry right then. She sat there holding her mother's hand for a very long time, as if letting go would be the moment everything truly ended. Her father stood out in the hallway, his back against the wall, both hands covering his face. He didn't come into the room. He couldn't bear it. From that day on, there were only 2 people left in the house. Jo's father, Frank Calloway, had worked as a dock laborer at the Redmore port for 20 years. He worked the morning shift, and Jo went to school. In the evenings, father and daughter sat down to dinner in their small rented house near the docks, usually sharing more silence than words. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they both knew that the empty place at the table, where her mother used to sit, couldn't be filled by anything anyone said. Frank wasn't good at talking. He showed love in other ways. Every morning before he left for work, he left Jo's lunch money on the table. On weekends, he taught her the things he knew: how to change a tire, how to check engine oil, how to bandage a wound when there was an accident at the port. "At the docks, anything can happen," he said. "You have to know how to take care of yourself." Jo didn't understand then why her father kept repeating that sentence. 2 years later, she understood. Jo was sitting in a heavy truck driving class when her phone vibrated. It was the port foreman's number. She stepped outside to answer, and the world beneath her feet collapsed in 15 seconds. Workplace accident. A crane cable had snapped. Cargo had fallen. Her father hadn't survived. Jo ran to the hospital, but by the time she got there, they had already covered her father's body with a white sheet. She stood in front of the emergency room door, looking through the small glass pane, and saw the familiar work boots sticking out from under the sheet. The boots he put on every morning before going to work. The boots he left outside the door every evening because he was afraid of tracking dirt into the house. Jo stood there for a very long time. No one at the hospital asked who she was, or whether she needed anything. A 20-year-old overweight girl, her clothes smudged and dirty, stood crying in front of the emergency room. People looked at her, then walked past. Her father's funeral took place on a sunny day. A few old co-workers from the port came, stood for a while, then left. No relatives, no extended family. Both of Jo's parents had moved to Redmore from another state for work, and they had no family there. After everyone had gone, Jo remained standing alone in front of her father's grave, beside her mother's grave. 20 years old. No father, no mother, no savings, no degree, not a single relative in the world she could call. The only thing she had was the heavy truck driver's license. She had passed the test for 2 weeks earlier, and a faded wedding photograph of her parents that she found in the nightstand drawer while clearing out their things. In the picture, her mother wore a white dress and smiled brightly. Her father stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his face slightly red because he was shy about being photographed. They both looked strangely young and happy. Jo folded the photograph and slipped it into her wallet, and she kept it there from that day on. She moved out of the old rented house and into a smaller, cheaper room right near the port. She applied for a job with the cargo truck delivery team at the docks. Night shift. Enough pay to survive. And from that day forward, Jolene Calloway stepped into the world alone, with nothing in her hands and a faded photograph in her wallet. The night shift at the Redmore port ran from 8 at night until 4 in the morning. Nobody wanted to drive that shift. The roads were dark, the warehouses were empty, the cargo was heavy, and the cold blowing in from the sea cut through skin and bone. But Jo chose the night shift from her very first day at work, not because it paid 20% more than the day shift, but for a reason much simpler than that. At night, no one looked at her. At night, she didn't have to see people's eyes sweep her from head to toe and then turn away. She didn't have to hear the quiet laughter behind her back. She didn't have to pretend she hadn't heard anything. Jo was the only female driver on the port's truck team. 17 men and 1 overweight girl, with calloused hands, broad shoulders, and a heavy way of walking. On the first day she drove the 18-wheel truck out of the lot. Several drivers stood smoking outside the gate, watching her go, and one of them said loudly enough for her to hear, "Whether that truck is hauling cargo or hauling her, it's carrying the same weight." The whole group burst out laughing. Jo didn't turn back. She drove straight ahead. Her teeth bit hard into her lip. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road, and her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. In the neighborhood near the port where Jo rented her room, the women weren't any kinder. They whispered every time they saw Jo coming home from work at 4 in the morning, her clothes smeared with oil, her face exhausted. What kind of girl hangs around outside in the middle of the night? No wonder no one wants to marry her. Jo heard every word clearly. She still walked straight ahead, without turning around, without answering. She had been used to that for a long time. 7 years alone had taught her that silence was easier than explaining, and that explanations didn't matter when no one wanted to listen. But silence didn't mean it didn't hurt. There were nights when Jo drove past the dark alley near the docks and saw drunken men blocking the way, harassing a woman walking alone. Jo stopped the truck, climbed down, and used her large body to push them away. The woman got free, but instead of thanking her, she looked Jo up and down and muttered, "No wonder no one wants her. What kind of woman looks like a man?" Then she walked away. Jo stayed there in the alley, alone, in the dark. It was always like that. She gave, and no one received it. She helped people, and they treated her as if she were invisible. Life went on that way, driving, delivering cargo, going back to her rented room, sleeping, then driving again. Every day was the same as the day before, until one night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, Jo parked her truck in the freight yard near the east side of the port to wait for the next run. She climbed down to get some air and wake herself up, and then she saw a dog curled beside a large trash bin. A Neapolitan Mastiff, so thin that its ribs showed clearly beneath the loose, wrinkled skin hanging from its body. A sagging muzzle, sorrowful eyes, dirty gray fur. It looked at Jo with the eyes of a creature that had grown used to being chased away from one place to another. When the truck drivers at the port saw it, they threw bottles to scare it off. Warehouse owners drove it away with sticks. No one wanted it nearby. Jo looked at the dog. The dog looked at Jo. She went back up into the cab, took her half-eaten meal box, set it on the ground a few steps away from the dog, then backed away. The dog didn't move. Jo didn't force it. She got into the truck and drove off. The next night, she parked in the exact same spot. The dog was waiting in the same place. Yesterday's meal box had been licked clean. Jo put down another one, this time 1 step closer. On the 3rd night, it came a little nearer. On the 4th night, it sat beside the wheel. A week later, when Jo opened the cab door, the dog jumped onto the passenger seat as if that place had belonged to it from the beginning. Jo didn't give it a name. She only called it You, because she was used to living without needing to call anyone by name. and because no one ever called her name in a gentle voice either. But from that night on, Joe no longer drove alone. The Mastiff sat in the passenger seat, its sagging muzzle resting on the dashboard, its sorrowful eyes watching the road ahead. Joe drove through the night across the empty roads around the port, and once in a while, she talked. Not to anyone, really, just to the dog. She talked about that day, about the cargo she had just delivered, about all the small, scattered things she couldn't say to any human being in the world. And every night, before the shift ended, Joe said the same sentence. You know, you and I are the same. Everybody gets scared when they look at our faces, but whoever bothers to ask what's going on inside? The dog didn't answer. It only rested its muzzle on her thigh and closed its eyes. And for Joe, that was enough. Wesley Greer was an accountant at a small transportation company near the port. Every morning, he stopped by the coffee shop at the head of the street to buy an Americano before going to work, right around 4:15, exactly when Joe finished her night shift and parked her truck in the lot behind the shop. Wesley didn't notice Joe the first time, but he noticed her the third time, because every morning, that girl climbed down from the cab utterly exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her clothes stained with engine oil, but the first thing she did wasn't buy a drink for herself. It was open the passenger door, pour water from an old bottle into a metal bowl, and let the wrinkled-faced dog drink first. After the dog finished drinking, she stroked its head, and only then did she go buy coffee for herself. Wesley saw that happen every morning, without fail, not a single time out of place. He began to grow curious about the girl who drove a truck twice her size, and loved an ugly dog more tenderly than she cared for herself. One morning, Wesley stood waiting by the shop door until Joe came in, then started a conversation. "Excuse me, do you drive at the port?" Joe looked at him the way she looked at everyone, cautious, stepping back half a step. "What do you need?" "Nothing. I just wanted to ask." Joe didn't answer. She took her coffee and walked straight back to her truck. Wesley didn't give up. He came back the next morning and asked something else. Then the morning after that, Joe didn't chase him away, but she didn't open herself up either. She was used to kindness always having a purpose, and she didn't want to know what his purpose was. But Wesley kept coming back, asking for nothing, not looking at her with pity or curiosity. He only asked ordinary questions. How many runs she had driven today, what the dog's name was, whether she was tired. Little by little, Joe began to answer. Little by little, she stopped stepping back half a step when she saw him. Little by little, the two of them sat outside the coffee shop and talked for 15 minutes every morning before Wesley went to work and Joe went home to sleep. One day, Wesley said something that made Joe go rigid. "You're stronger than every man I know, but you smile like you're afraid someone might see it." Joe didn't answer. But from that day on, she began to smile more when she was with him. They loved each other in the quietest way possible. No one knew. Wesley didn't tell his coworkers. Joe had no one to tell. They met every morning at the coffee shop, and sometimes Wesley came to Joe's rented room in the afternoon. The two of them sat together eating takeout, talking about small, ordinary things. For the first time in 7 lonely years, Joe felt that someone truly wanted to stay beside her. But 6 months later, Wesley told his family he wanted to marry Joe, and everything fell apart. Wesley's mother, a middle-class woman living in Redmore's clean suburban neighborhood, nearly choked when she heard Joe's name. She had never met Joe, but she didn't need to. Wesley told her what Joe did for a living, where she lived, what she looked like, and that was enough for her to say one single sentence. "You want to marry that fat truck-driving girl from the port? You want this whole family to be too ashamed to hold our heads up, Wesley?" Wesley fell silent. He didn't argue with his mother. He came back and told his friends, hoping someone would support him. No one supported him. His best friend laughed right in his face. "You're marrying her so she can carry things around the house more easily?" Wesley began to retreat. Not in one obvious step, but slowly, in the kind of retreat that takes the person being left behind a long time to recognize. Messages that used to come every day became every other day, then every 2 days. Plans were made, then canceled at the last minute. The reason was always reasonable. Busy, tired, something going on with his family. Joe knew. She didn't say it, but she knew. She had been familiar with the feeling of people leaving long before they actually walked out the door. One morning, Joe sat waiting for Wesley at their usual coffee shop. 4:15, 4:30, 4:45, 5 o'clock. He didn't come. Joe sat there for another half hour, then drove home. The next day, she went looking for Wesley in the parking lot of his company. He was walking out, and when he saw Joe, he stopped, his eyes lowering. Joe asked him directly, her voice calmer than she had expected. "You didn't come. Why?" Wesley didn't look at her. He looked down at his polished leather shoes, stayed silent for a very long moment, then said, "My family doesn't approve. I can't, Joe." Joe nodded, slowly, lightly, as if she had known the answer before she asked the question. "I understand." She said exactly those 2 words, then turned away. She walked fast. Not running, but fast enough that Wesley couldn't see the tears falling down her face. She didn't look back. She didn't call his name. She didn't ask him to think again, because Joe knew asking wouldn't change anything. People didn't leave because there weren't enough reasons to stay. People left because they didn't have enough courage to stand beside her in front of the world. That night, Joe didn't drive a single cargo run. She drove out to the empty lot behind the port, shut off the engine, and sat in the dark cab. The Mastiff jumped from the passenger seat and rested its big, heavy, wrinkled head on her lap. Joe placed her hand on its head, her fingers trembling slightly. She sat for a very long time in silence. Then she spoke, her voice so small that only the dog could hear it. "Maybe people like us weren't born to be loved, but at least I still have you." The dog didn't answer. It only pressed its head deeper into her lap and closed its eyes. Outside the cab, Redmore Port lay empty and still, with only the sound of waves striking the seawall and the wind slipping through the spaces between the containers. Joe sat there until morning came. While Joe sat crying in the truck cab in the middle of the night on an empty lot, less than 5 kilometers away, on the top floor of the Thornton building overlooking the entire port, a meeting was taking place, and the silence in the room was heavier than any word being spoken. 11 men sat around a long oak table. No one looked at anyone else. All of them looked toward the end of the table, where Barrett Thornton sat. He hadn't spoken since the meeting began. He didn't need to. The mere fact that he was sitting there was enough to make the whole room afraid to breathe too loudly. Barrett was 33 years old, the youngest person in that room, but the only one the other 10 men had to address as Sir. He had inherited his father Hank Thornton's place, running the Thornton empire of transportation and eastern Redmore seaports, including the operations no one dared to name in broad daylight. When Barrett wanted something to happen, it happened. When Barrett wanted someone to disappear from the negotiation table, that person disappeared. No noise, no explanation. Today, in the middle of the room, a middle-aged man was kneeling on the marble floor. His name was Morris, a business partner of the Thornton family, and he owed a large sum of money that he hadn't paid in 6 months. Morris knelt there, sweat running down his temples, both hands clasped in front of his chest, his voice shaking so badly that he swallowed half his words. "Please give me more time, just a few more weeks. I'll have enough, I swear." Barrett looked at Morris. Not angry, not contemptuous, not showing any expression at all. He only looked at him, silently, for a very long time. It was the kind of silence that made the man being watched wish he were dead, rather than endure one more second of it. Then Barrett opened his mouth, his voice even, low and slow. "I'm giving you 48 hours. At the 49th hour, don't make me come looking for you." Morris nodded again and again, backing out of the room on his knees. No one in the room watched him go. No one commented. The meeting continued. When everyone left one by one, only one man remained behind. Garrett Slade, Barrett's right-hand man. The man who had been with him since the first day Barrett took over the Thornton Empire. Slade was 3 years older than Barrett, tall and lean, a man of few words and many actions. Barrett trusted Slade more than he trusted anyone. In a world where loyalty was measured in money, Slade was the only person Barrett believed had stayed for something other than money, or at least, that was what he thought. Slade waited until the room was completely empty before speaking. "There's something happening at the Eastern Warehouse Row. These past few days, I've seen unusual activity. Not like our cargo. I sent men to check, but no one dares make the call. This is something only you can handle." Barrett looked at Slade. "Unusual how?" "Not clear. It could be loose cargo someone hid in one of our warehouses. It could be something worse. I think you should go see it yourself. Tonight." Barrett nodded. He didn't suspect anything. Slade had never given him a reason to suspect him. Never. Until that night. At 11 o'clock at night, Barrett arrived at the Eastern Warehouse Row in his private car, accompanied by 2 close bodyguards. The old warehouse district stood close to the port, nothing but gray concrete blocks lined up in the dark, the weak streetlights barely enough to shine over the wet road. Barrett stepped out of the car and walked toward warehouse number 7, following Slade's directions. The 2 bodyguards followed behind him. The warehouse door was already open. Inside, it was pitch black. Barrett took 3 steps in, then stopped. The instinct of a man who had lived in the underworld told him something wasn't right. Too quiet. There was no strange cargo, no sign of activity, only darkness and the smell of damp mold. He turned back. The 2 bodyguards had stepped back outside the warehouse door. They stood there, looking at him, but they didn't come in. Their eyes avoided Barrett's gaze. And Barrett understood. He understood 1 second later than he needed to. Dark shapes rushed in from both sides. 4 men. Fast, strong, precise. Barrett fought back and took 1 man down, but 4 against 1 in the dark left him no chance. An attack came from behind. A long wound sliced across his side. Barrett fell onto the concrete floor, among collapsed stacks of old cargo crates. Blood soaked through his shirt. His vision began to blur. He heard footsteps approaching. Then Slade's voice. Garrett Slade stepped out of the darkness and stood watching Barrett lying on the ground. His face showed no remorse, no anger, only emptiness, like a man who had finished calculating everything long ago. "I'm sorry, Bear, but there's only room for 1 man in that position." Barrett wanted to say something, but his body no longer obeyed him. He watched Slade turn his back, walk out, and order the men to leave. The warehouse door closed. Engines started, then faded into the distance. Silence. Only Barrett remained, lying alone on the cold concrete floor in the night, in a warehouse district where no one set foot at this hour, no one except the night shift delivery trucks. And that night, 1 truck was driving toward this place. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Jo drove her truck past the Eastern Warehouse Row, the way she did every night. She had taken this route hundreds of times, knew every pothole, every turn, every warehouse door that was usually closed and every one that was usually open. Tonight, something was different. The headlights swept across warehouse number 7, and Jo saw the iron door had been forced open, twisted, hanging crooked on its hinges. She hadn't even had time to think when the mastiff in the passenger seat suddenly sprang to its feet, the fur along its neck standing up, a low growl scraping in its throat. 7 years of night driving had taught Jo one thing. When the dog reacted, something was wrong. She stopped the truck, turned off the headlights, and sat still for a few seconds, listening. There was no sound except the sea wind and the light patter of rain. She pulled the flashlight from the cab compartment, opened the door, and climbed down. The dog jumped after her, staying close to her legs. Jo stepped into warehouse number 7. The flashlight swept through the darkness. Cargo crates were scattered everywhere, several of them smashed open, goods strewn across the floor. Then the beam of light landed on a pair of black leather shoes. Jo stopped. She lifted the light higher. A man lay face down in the middle of the wreckage, motionless. His gray suit jacket was soaked, and a long wound across his right side had torn through the fabric of his shirt. His whole body was covered in injuries. Jo knelt down and turned the man over. His face was pale blue, his lips dry and cracked, his breathing so faint that she had to place her hand in front of his nose to feel it. Alive, but not for much longer. Jo didn't think. She acted. 7 years of driving trucks, the first aid her father had taught her before he died, the workplace safety training required of heavy-duty drivers. All of it moved through her hands like reflex. She ran back to the truck, grabbed a coil of cargo strap, used a knife to cut the strap into long strips, then returned and wrapped them tightly around the wound in the man's side, pressing hard in the proper way to control the bleeding. He groaned softly when Jo tightened the bandage, but he didn't wake. Next came the hardest part. This man weighed nearly 100 kilograms. Jo weighed almost as much, but she was a truck driver used to lifting cargo boxes, pulling chains, and tightening bolts that secured containers every night. She slid her arms under his armpits, gathered every bit of strength in her body, and dragged him out of the wreckage, through the warehouse door, across the wet concrete yard, step by step, until she reached the back of the truck. She lowered the tailgate, pulled him up onto the cargo bed, and rested his head on a folded tarp. Her hands were shaking from the effort, Her shoulders burned with pain, but he was on the truck. Joe climbed into the cab, started the engine, turned the truck around, and headed toward Redmore Hospital. She drove as fast as she could on the wet road, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror to check on the man behind her. About 5 minutes later, she heard a sound from the cargo bed. A groan. Then a hand gripped the side of the truck, trembling. Joe looked through the mirror. The man had opened his eyes, though only by a narrow slit. He tried to lift his head, his mouth moving. Joe rolled down the cab window, turned back, and shouted, "I'm taking you to the hospital. Stay still." His voice was so weak the wind almost carried it away, but Joe heard every word clearly. "No. Hospital. Not safe." Then his hand dropped loose. His head fell back onto the floor of the truck bed. He passed out again. Joe gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding hard. Not safe. This man was running from someone. Someone had wanted him dead in that warehouse tonight. If she took him to the hospital, where they'd have to ask his name, his address, call the police, then whoever wanted him killed would know he was still alive. Joe turned the wheel. She didn't go to the hospital. She turned the truck around and drove toward her rented room. 15 minutes later, Joe parked in the narrow alley behind the boarding house. She pulled the man down from the truck bed, carried him through the back door, and laid him on the only bed in her room. She cut open his suit jacket, replaced the pressure bandage, and cleaned the dirt around the wound with warm water and a clean towel. She checked his breathing. Weak, but steady. She checked his pulse. Slow, but still there. She did everything her father had once taught her, step by step, missing nothing. When she had done everything she could, Joe sat down on the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the rise and fall of the man's chest on the bed. The mastiff lay at the foot of the bed, its head resting on its front paws, eyes open, guarding the stranger. The room was dark. Only the streetlight slipped through the gap in the curtains and shone across the ceiling. Joe didn't sleep. She sat there counting his breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. If his breathing stopped, she would call emergency services no matter what, but his breathing didn't stop. It was weak, it was slow, but it didn't stop. Joe sat there all night. No food, no water, no closing her eyes. A girl the whole city called useless was using everything she had to keep alive, a man whose name she didn't even know. Outside, the rain slowly began to ease. Morning was almost coming, and Joe didn't know that within a few hours, the most dangerous people in Redmore would come looking for her door. Dawn had just broken. Joe was kneeling beside the bed, changing the bandage on the strange man, when she heard vehicles stopping outside the door. Not one vehicle. Several. The heavy rumble of engines, the repeated slam of car doors, the sound of quick, decisive footsteps on the road. The mastiff, which had been lying at the foot of the bed, suddenly sprang up, ears raised, muzzle pointed toward the door, a low growl scraping in its throat. Joe hadn't even managed to stand before the boarding house door was kicked open. 3 men rushed in, large, cold-faced, their hands tucked inside their jackets. Behind them, 4 more men blocked every exit to the back alley. Joe shot to her feet and backed against the wall, instinctively shielding the bed where the man was lying. One of the men looked at the bed, saw Barrett, and his face changed instantly. He turned and spoke quickly into the radio clipped to his lapel. "Found him. He's alive. There's a woman here." Everything after that happened very fast. They carried Barrett out on a makeshift stretcher. A black SUV was parked close to the door, its windows dark-tinted, its license plate clean. Joe was trapped between 2 men, one on each side, and pushed out of the room. She tried to struggle. "I'm the one who saved him. I found him at the warehouse. Let me explain." No one listened. They shoved her into another vehicle and locked the door. The mastiff lunged after her, barking viciously, baring its teeth, trying to jump onto the vehicle. One man kicked it away. It rolled across the road, then scrambled back to its feet and kept chasing the cars until the convoy turned onto the main road, and it couldn't keep up anymore. 20 minutes later, the convoy stopped in front of the gates of a large mansion on a high hill overlooking the port, the Thornton Mansion. Joe was led through the iron gate, across the wide courtyard, and inside. She had never set foot in a place like this, but she had no time to look at anything, because in front of her, in the middle of the vast living room, an old man was waiting. Hank Thornton, 62 years old, silver-haired, his back slightly bent, but his eyes still sharp as knives. He watched his son being carried on a stretcher straight upstairs. Barrett's body was covered in bandages, his face pale blue, unconscious. Then Hank turned to look at Joe. He looked at her for a very long time. An overweight girl, her clothes smeared with engine oil and grime, her hands still stained with half-used bandage gauze, her hair tangled, her face drained from staying awake all night. She didn't look like a savior. She looked more like a suspect. Hank spoke, his voice deep and slow, each word like a nail being driven in. "Who sent you?" Joe shook her head. "No one sent me. I was driving past the warehouse area, found him badly wounded, brought him back to my place, and bandaged him." Hank raised his hand. Joe stopped in the middle of the sentence. "My son was attacked, and you, a stranger, happened to be there, happened to bring him back to your room, happened to know how to dress a wound." He repeated the word "happened" 3 times, each one heavier than the last. "I don't believe in coincidence. I'm a night shift truck driver at the port," Joe said, trying to keep her voice steady even though her whole body was trembling. "I drive that route every night. I know first aid because my job requires it. I only wanted to save him." Hank didn't answer. He looked at Joe for a few more seconds, as if weighing whether she was worth trusting or worth killing, then turned to the subordinate beside him. "Lock her up. When my son wakes, I'll know the truth." Joe struggled as 2 men grabbed both her arms and dragged her away. "I didn't do anything wrong. I saved him." No one turned back. No one looked at her. She was dragged down a long hallway, down the stairs, through a heavy iron door, then shoved into a basement room. The door closed, the lock turned, then silence. Outside the mansion, the Mastiff had followed Joe's scent all the way from the boarding house to this place. It stood in front of the iron gate, panting hard, staring inside. The guards chased it away. It backed up a few steps, then came back. They chased it away again. It came back again. In the end, the guards ignored it, and the dog lay down right in front of the gate, its muzzle resting on its front paws, its eyes fixed on the long courtyard leading to the mansion door. It didn't go. It didn't leave. In the basement, Joe sat on the cold concrete floor, dark, silent, no windows, no light, only a narrow crack beneath the iron door spilling in a little dull, cloudy glow. No one brought food down. No one brought water. On the first day, Joe knocked on the door. She knocked until her hands burned raw. No one answered. She cried out, "I didn't do anything wrong. Let me see someone. Let me explain." Silence swallowed every sound. On the second day, Joe stopped knocking. She curled up in the corner, hugging her knees, her eyes closed. Hunger began clawing inside her stomach. Thirst cracked her lips. She thought of the dog. She didn't know where it was. She didn't know whether anyone had fed it. On the third day, Joe began to draw. She used her finger to move across the dust-covered concrete floor, each line slow and careful. The first thing she drew was the dog, its sagging muzzle, its sorrowful eyes, its drooping ears. The second was the truck, the square cab, the round wheels, the small rearview mirror she looked into every night. The third was 2 faces, one male and one female, rough and crooked, but she knew who they were, her father and her mother. She drew them over and over, erased them, then drew them again, as if the moment her hand stopped moving, she would forget who she was. Because in the dark, with no sound, no people, and nothing to hold on to, a person could forget so easily. Forget their own name, forget how they had once lived, forget that they still existed. Joe drew so she could remember that she was still Jolene Calloway, a night shift truck driver at Redmore Port, the woman with one ugly, loyal dog and 2 faded photographs of her parents in an old wallet. She drew until her finger went numb, and her mind began sinking into a half-waking, half-dreaming sleep. On the concrete floor around her, the dust was full of drawings, and above her, a few floors away, Barrett Thornton still hadn't opened his eyes. Barrett Thornton opened his eyes on the afternoon of the 4th day. The light slipping through the curtains of the mansion's master bedroom struck his eyes like a knife. He lay still, without moving, letting his body slowly reclaim each sense. Pain. His right side hurt violently every time he breathed in. His left hand was attached to an IV. The smell of antiseptic. The steady beeping of the heart monitor beside his ear. And memory returned, piece by piece, like shards of broken glass, coming together into a picture. The warehouse, the darkness, the 2 bodyguards stepping back toward the door, 4 dark shapes rushing in, the attack from behind, the cold concrete floor beneath his face, Slade's voice, even and empty, There's only room for one man in that position. Then silence. Then death, slowly crawling toward him through the dark. Then something else. Fainter, but real. The smell of engine oil. Someone dragging him. Pain, but he was being pulled, being moved. A woman's voice, hoarse but clear. "Don't die. Do you hear me?" Then a small room, a narrow bed, someone sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, eyes open, watching over him all night. He remembered forcing his eyes open once in the middle of the night and seeing a large figure sitting motionless in the dark, and a dog lying at the foot of the bed. Then the darkness swallowed him again. Barrett lay still, absorbing each piece of memory. He didn't call anyone. He didn't press the bell. He needed to understand where he stood on the board before letting anyone know he was awake. 10 minutes later, the bedroom door opened. The family's private doctor came in to examine him. Barrett opened his eyes, looked at the doctor, and spoke in a voice weak but clear enough. "How many days?" "4 days, sir. The wound was deep, but it didn't hit any organs. You lost a lot of blood. It's fortunate you received first aid in time before you were brought here." "Who gave me first aid?" The doctor hesitated. "A woman. I don't know the details. Mr. Hank knows more." Barrett nodded slightly and closed his eyes again, as if he were tired. The doctor left. Half an hour later, Hank came in. He sat beside his son's bed, his face looking several years older than it had 4 days ago. His eyes red from lack of sleep. "You're awake. Good." Barrett looked at his father, his eyes a little unfocused, his voice slow. "I don't remember clearly. I went to the warehouse then. Everything went dark. I woke up here." Hank held his son's hand. "Slade, that bastard betrayed you. I've got people hunting him down." Barrett nodded slowly, his face expressionless. He pretended to be tired and closed his eyes. Hank sat there for a few more minutes, then left. Barrett opened his eyes the moment the door closed. All through that day, Barrett questioned each person. Every time someone entered the room, he asked one question, gently, as if curious, not as if he were interrogating them. When a servant brought in porridge, he asked, "Who brought me back here?" The servant said, "The security team found you at a woman's house near the port. They used the GPS signal from your watch." Barrett nodded. When a new guard came in to replace the IV, he asked again, "Where is that woman now?" The guard looked uneasy. "Mr. Hank ordered her kept here, in the basement." "How long?" Silence. 4 days, sir." "Has anyone given her food or water?" The silence was longer this time. The guard looked down at the floor. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Barrett lay still. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, but his mind was fitting the pieces together. A woman had found him in the warehouse, given him first aid, brought him back to her home, and watched over him all night. Then his father's men had come, taken him away, and locked her in the basement for 4 days without food or water. Barrett also asked another servant about the dog. The servant told him, "There's a very big dog, with a wrinkled face, lying outside the gate since the first day. The guards chased it away several times, but it wouldn't go." "It's still there now." Barrett asked nothing more. That evening, Barrett called Hank into the room. Hank came in, closed the door, and sat down in the chair beside the bed. Barrett looked at his father, and this time his eyes were no longer hazy. He was awake, completely awake. "You locked the woman who saved me in the basement." Hank hadn't had time to react to the change in his son's voice. "You don't know who she is yet. She could be connected to Slade. She could be a trap. I had to. She brought me back to her home." Barrett cut him off, his voice low, slow, never rising, but each word heavy as stone. "She tore cargo straps apart to bandage my wound. She sat on the floor of her own room and watched over me all night. And you locked her up for 4 days with no food and no water." Hank opened his mouth. "Barrett, I did that to protect. Open the basement now. You need to calm down. I'll have someone verify. Open the basement now, or I'll open it myself." Barrett didn't speak the last sentence even 1 decibel louder than the one before it, but Hank understood. He knew that voice. It was the voice Barrett had used with Morris when the man knelt on the floor begging for more time to pay his debt. It was the voice Barrett used when he had made his decision, and nothing in the world could change it. Hank stood, called a guard, and ordered the basement opened. Barrett got out of bed. the wound in his side flaring so sharply that he had to grip the bed frame for several seconds. But he didn't stop. He followed the guard down the stairs, through the hallway, to the iron door. The key turned, the door opened. The smell of dampness rushed out. The darkness inside was thick and heavy. Barrett stepped in. His eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dark, and then he saw her. Jo was curled in the farthest corner of the room, her knees pressed tight against her chest, her arms hanging at her sides. She was visibly thinner than she had been 4 days ago, her eyes sunken deep, her lips dry and cracked, her clothes still the same filthy set from that night, and on the floor around her, concrete dust had been drawn into dozens of pictures. Barrett looked down, a dog with a sagging muzzle, a truck, 2 faces, 1 male and 1 female, rough and crooked, but drawn over and over again, each time a little clearer, as if the person drawing them was afraid of forgetting their faces. Barrett knelt beside Jo. The wound in his side tore with pain when his knee hit the floor, but he didn't care. Jo opened her eyes. Slowly, heavily, as if it took all the strength she had left just to lift her eyelids. She looked at him, not afraid, not angry, not blaming him. She looked at him for a few seconds, then spoke, her voice dry and rough from 4 days without water. "You're alive? That's good." Barrett went rigid. She was close to death. 4 days in the dark, hungry, thirsty, alone in the basement, because she had saved him. And the first thing she said when she saw him wasn't, "Why did you lock me up?" Wasn't, "Let me out," but relief that he was still alive. Barrett looked at the drawings on the floor, looked at her dusty, calloused hands, looked into her hollowed eyes, where something still shone that he hadn't found in anyone around him in all his 33 years. He spoke, his voice soft, softer than any words he had ever spoken to anyone. "You'll never be treated like this again." Barrett ordered Jo moved into the finest guest room in the mansion that very night. The family doctor was called in to examine her, give her fluids, and replenish her nutrition. Servants brought hot porridge and water up to the room. Jo slowly came back to herself after several hours of care, but she wasn't used to anything around her. When a servant invited her to sit in the leather chair by the window, Jo shook her head and stepped back. "I'm really dirty. Just let me sit on the floor." The servant looked at her, not understanding. Barrett stood outside the bedroom door, heard those words, and said nothing. He only stood still for a very long time, then walked away. The mastiff was brought into the mansion on Barrett's order. When a servant led it up to Jo's room, it rushed straight to her, rubbing its big, heavy head against her legs, its tail wagging without stopping. Jo sat down on the floor and wrapped her arms around it, and that was the first time she had smiled since being locked in the basement. In the days that followed, Jo slowly recovered. She could eat, drink, and walk again, but she still kept her distance from everything in the mansion as if she were a boarder who had wandered into the wrong room. Barrett began stopping by Jo's room every evening. At first, he only asked whether she needed anything. Then, little by little, the two of them talked longer. Jo told him about driving trucks, about the night roads, about the dog she had found near the port's trash yard, about her father, the man who had taught her first aid and how to change a tire before he passed away. Barrett listened and said little, but his eyes never left her. Then one evening, Barrett said something he had never said to anyone. "I have hundreds of people around me every day, but I don't remember the last time I had a real conversation with anyone." Jo looked at him and tilted her head. "At least a stray dog is real. It comes because it wants to, not because it's afraid." Barrett didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth moved, so slightly it was almost invisible. It was the first time in a very long while that anyone had seen Barrett Thornton almost smile. About a week after the night Barrett saved Jo from the basement, she wandered through the mansion late at night because she couldn't sleep. The habit of working night shifts was carved deep into her body. After 11 o'clock, her eyes would be wide open. She passed Barrett's study and saw the door slightly ajar, warm yellow lamplight spilling into the hallway. She was about to walk past when she saw Barrett sitting alone inside the room. In front of him was a small photograph on the desk. He wasn't doing anything. He was only sitting there, looking at the photograph. Jo was about to turn away when Barrett said, without turning around, "Come in." Jo stepped inside and sat down in the chair across from him. She didn't ask. She only sat there and waited. Barrett was silent for a very long time. Then he said, "My mother. She died when I was 19. He touched the edge of the photograph with one finger. "They said it was an accident, but I didn't believe it. I never believed it. His voice was even, not trembling. But Joe heard something heavier than tears hidden behind every word, Barrett told her. Not at length, not dramatically. His mother had died in an event the family called an unfortunate incident. Barrett had always believed that one of his father's allies had a hand in it, but Hank never investigated. The alliance mattered more. The truth mattered more. My father chose to keep power instead of seeking justice for my mother, Barrett said, his eyes still fixed on the photograph. From that day on, I didn't trust anyone. No one stays beside me for me. It's always for money, for fear, or because they need something from me. Joe sat listening, without interrupting, without saying, I understand, without saying, I'm sorry, or any of the comfort people usually offered when they didn't know what else to say. She sat quietly for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice gentle. I lost my mother too, but at least I know no one deliberately stole her from me. You've endured more than I have. Barrett looked up. For 14 years, whenever he mentioned his mother, people either avoided it or said empty things like, she's in a better place now, or quickly changed the subject. No one had ever admitted that his pain was heavy. No one had ever placed his pain before their own. Joe had just done that. She, a woman who had lost both her father and her mother, who had lived alone for 7 years, who had been laughed at by the whole world, had just said that he had endured more than she had. Barrett didn't answer. He only looked at Joe, and in the pale yellow light of the desk lamp, for the first time, something in his eyes softened. 2 weeks later, Joe had fully recovered. One morning, she found Barrett in the downstairs living room and spoke directly. I want to go home. I'm grateful that you took care of me. But I don't belong here. I'm a truck driver. I live in a rented room near the port. Your world isn't my place. Barrett looked at her. Why do you think that? Joe lowered her face, her voice smaller. All my life, people have told me I'm not worthy. I'm fat, I'm rough, I have nothing. Maybe they're right. I don't fit in a place like this. Barrett was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. Not in the voice of a crime boss. Not in the voice of a man giving orders. But in the voice of a man telling the truth from the deepest place he had. You're the only person here I trust. I pay my men, so they stay for money. Allies stay for benefit. You saved me when you didn't know who I was, didn't know what I had. You sat on the floor of your own room and watched over me all night because you wanted to, not because I was Barrett Thornton. He paused, looking straight into her eyes. They were wrong. Every single one of them was wrong about you. Joe didn't answer. She stood there, eyes red, lips pressed tight together, trying not to cry. She was used to people telling her she wasn't good enough. She wasn't used to someone telling her she was good enough and truly believing it. She didn't say she would stay, but she didn't walk away either. And Barrett understood that this was her answer. Tiffany Braddock arrived at the Thornton mansion one afternoon without warning, as if this place had long been her home. She was the only daughter of the Braddock family, the Thornton family's closest ally for the past 15 years. Hank Thornton had chosen Tiffany for Barrett when the two of them were still young, a marriage calculated to bind two empires together, and Tiffany had lived with that thought, as if she were living inside a promise already signed. She walked into the mansion through the front door, her heels clicking against the stone floor, her head held high, her eyes sweeping over everything with the gaze of someone who owned it. Then she saw Joe. Joe was sitting at a small table in the secondary living room, wearing the clean clothes the servants had given her, yet still looking out of place among those expensive walls. The mastiff lay at her feet, its muzzle resting on Joe's knee. Tiffany stopped. She looked Joe up and down, openly, without hiding it, without needing to hide it. Then she turned to the two men standing nearby, and spoke loudly enough for the whole room to hear. So this is what Barrett brought home? I thought he was keeping a stray dog. But it turns out he's keeping a stray woman, too. The two men's faces went stiff, neither of them knowing how to react. A servant wiping a table in the distance stopped and looked down. The whole room fell silent. Joe heard every word clearly. She lifted her eyes to Tiffany, and for one moment, the two women's eyes met. Tiffany looked at Joe with undisguised contempt. Joe looked at Tiffany with the eyes of someone who had heard too many words like that to be surprised anymore. She didn't answer. Not one word. She placed her hand on the dog's head, slowly stood, and walked out of the room. Straight down to the kitchen. The old cook was preparing dinner for the servants. Joe walked in, rolled up her sleeves, and asked, "Do you need help with anything?" The cook looked at her in surprise, then pointed to a basket of unwashed vegetables. Joe began washing vegetables, chopping onions, quietly working beside the people Tiffany had never even bothered to see. News of what had happened in the living room reached Barrett in less than 10 minutes. A guard reported it to him. Barrett listened, his face unchanged, but his eyes darkened by one shade, and those who had followed him for years knew that was a dangerous sign. He didn't go looking for Joe. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He did something else. Barrett ordered the exact 2 men who had stood in the living room when Tiffany said those words to be summoned. The 2 men walked into the small meeting room on the 2nd floor and saw Tiffany already standing there, her face slightly confused because she didn't understand why she had been called there. Barrett stood at the end of the room, his back against the table, his arms folded across his chest. He looked at Tiffany, then at the 2 men, then back at Tiffany. His voice didn't rise, didn't fall, remaining as even as the surface of still water before a storm. "You just insulted my person, in front of my people." Tiffany drew in a breath. "Barrett, I'm not finished." Tiffany closed her mouth. Barrett continued, still in that same even voice. "The Braddock family and the Thornton family have been allies for 15 years. Do you want those 15 years to end in 15 seconds? The blood drained from Tiffany's face. She understood that Barrett wasn't joking. She had known him since childhood, had known him long enough to understand that Barrett Thornton never said anything he wasn't ready to carry out. He was threatening to tear apart an alliance worth millions of dollars, one built over 15 years, all because of one sentence that insulted Joe. Barrett turned to the 2 men, his voice still unchanged. "Jolene Calloway is my person. Does anyone still have a question?" The 2 men stood straight, their eyes fixed on the floor. No one opened their mouth. No one dared look up. Barrett looked at Tiffany one last time, then walked out of the room. He didn't say another word. Tiffany remained standing there, both hands clenched together, her face white as ash. She left the mansion 10 minutes later without saying goodbye to anyone, without looking back. Down in the kitchen, Joe was still washing vegetables. She didn't know what had just happened on the 2nd floor. No one told her. But from that afternoon on, something changed. The servants looked at Joe differently, no longer with curiosity or pity in their eyes. When Joe entered a room, they nodded in greeting. When she helped in the kitchen, the old cook pulled out a chair for her to sit. When she walked in the yard, the guards nodded instead of looking away. Joe didn't understand why. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she was walking through a place where people didn't laugh behind her back. She didn't know that it happened because Barrett Thornton, the most powerful boss of the Eastern Port, had just placed an entire empire behind her with one sentence in a room she had never stepped into. Garrett Slade still hadn't been caught. After the night he ambushed Barrett at the warehouse, he vanished from Redmore as if he had never existed. But he didn't disappear completely. He still had eyes in the city. He was still watching the Thornton mansion from a distance. And he knew one thing that all of Redmore had begun to whisper. Barrett Thornton, the boss who never let anyone close, was keeping a woman inside his mansion. Slade didn't need to know who Joe was. He only needed to know that she mattered to Barrett. And in the underworld, if you wanted to bring down a powerful man, you didn't need to strike the man himself. You only needed to strike the thing he couldn't bear to lose. That night, around 1 o'clock in the morning, Joe couldn't sleep. 7 years of driving the night shift didn't disappear just because she had changed where she slept. Once it passed 11 o'clock, her eyes stayed wide open, her body restless, her arms and legs uneasy. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling for 2 hours until she couldn't stand it anymore. She needed to go outside. She needed to breathe the air of the port, smell the familiar scent of engine oil, hear the waves striking the seawall. She knew the mansion had guards, cameras, and locked gates, but Joe was someone who knew every corner of Redmore Port. The mansion's back gate bordered a small alley leading out to the coastal road, and the lock on that back gate was only a basic latch. Joe lifted the latch, slipped out, and walked along the coastal road toward the old port district. The Mastiff didn't come with her because she didn't want it running loose in the street. She went alone. Slade had assigned men to watch the mansion's back gate for more than a week, waiting for this exact moment. Joe had walked less than 10 minutes when a small truck pulled up close to the curb ahead of her. Before she could react, 2 men grabbed her from behind, covered her mouth, and dragged her into the vehicle. Joe fought. She was strong, used to lifting heavy cargo and pulling chains every night. But the 2 men were bigger than she was, and they already had restraints ready. The vehicle door slammed shut. The truck sped away into the night. When Jo came fully awake again, she was lying on the cold metal floor of a shipping container, pitch dark. Her hands were tied with industrial cable, the same kind of cable she used every night to secure cargo on the truck bed. The air was suffocating, heavy with the smell of metal and old engine oil. Jo lay still for a few seconds, forcing herself to stay calm. She listened. The sound of the sea was close, the sound of containers knocking against one another in the wind, the distant sound of a forklift, the western dock. She recognized it immediately. She had driven through here on hundreds of nights. At the same time, Barrett's phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered. Slade's voice came through, calm in a way that made it hateful. "If you want her alive, come alone. Western dock. Container section C. You have 2 hours." Barrett set the phone down on the desk. He didn't slam it, didn't shout, didn't punch the wall. He sat motionless for 3 seconds, eyes fixed on the darkness. Then he stood, called his 4 most loyal guards into the room, closed the door, and began making a plan. Inside the container, Jo didn't sit still and wait to die. She was a truck driver. She knew cables, knew container locks, knew the inside structure of these metal boxes better than anyone guarding her outside. She rolled to her side, used her legs to push herself toward the container wall, and searched with her back until she touched a piece of iron jutting out in the corner, an old shelf support bar. The iron edge wasn't sharp, but it was rough enough. Jo twisted her body, pressed the cable, binding her hands against the edge of the iron bar, and began to saw. Back and forth, back and forth. The cable cut into her wrists every time she rubbed it, bruising her skin purple, then tearing it open, pain burning through her. But Jo clenched her teeth and kept going. She had once dragged a man who weighed nearly 100 kilograms across a rain-slick concrete yard. A little pain in her wrists couldn't stop her. After more than 40 minutes, the cable loosened enough for Jo to pull one hand free. She untied the other hand, sat up, and rubbed her swollen, bruised wrists. She was free of the cable, but Jo didn't run. She could hear footsteps outside the container, at least 2 men guarding it. Running out would mean handing herself over. She needed to do something else. Jo looked around in the dark, her eyes already adjusting to the weak light slipping in through the ventilation gaps on the container roof. The ventilation system. 4 small square openings on the ceiling, each covered by a thin metal panel fixed with rivets. Jo stood, reached up to the ceiling, and began prying loose one of the ventilation covers. Her hands hurt, but the fingers of a truck driver, used to turning bolts and tightening nuts, didn't need tools. She bent the cover until it popped free, then used it to strike the side of the container. Steady. Once every 3 seconds, the sound of metal against metal rang across the container yard, clear and rhythmic, not like wind or natural impact. It was a signal. Whoever came looking for her would hear it. Barrett arrived at the western dock exactly on time, alone, walking through the gate into Section C as Slade had demanded. But his 4 guards had already been in ambush positions for 30 minutes, spread around the container yard, hidden in the dark. Barrett walked between 2 tall rows of containers, his steps even, neither fast nor slow. He heard the steady metallic tapping echoing from somewhere inside Section C, once every 3 seconds. He knew it was Jo. He knew she wasn't sitting still. Slade stepped out of the darkness at the end of the row, both hands tucked in his pockets. 3 men standing behind him. He looked at Barrett and smiled. "Right on time. I always liked that about you." Barrett didn't smile. He looked at Slade with the same gaze that had made 11 men lower their heads in the meeting room the week before. "Open the container." "Not yet," Slade said. "You know what I want." "You want to die," Barrett replied, his voice even. "You just don't know it yet." Slade didn't have time to answer. Barrett's 4 guards stepped out from 4 directions at once, weapons aimed directly at Slade's group. Slade's 3 men looked around, realized there was no way out, and lowered their hands. Slade stood in the middle, his face going pale, his smile vanishing. He was restrained in less than 10 seconds, both hands pinned behind his back, forced down onto his knees on the concrete. Barrett didn't look at Slade for another half second. He walked straight to the container that was still giving off that steady metallic signal, pulled the latch, and opened the heavy iron door. The dock lights spilled inside. Jo sat in the corner of the container, her back against the wall, her bruised hands hanging at her sides, the ventilation cover still in her right hand. Her eyes looked straight at the door, alert, without a single tear. Barrett stood at the container entrance, looking at her. The restraints had been removed, coiled on the floor beside the iron bar marked with scraped metal. She had untied herself. She had made her own signal. She hadn't sat there waiting for anyone to save her. The first thing Joe said when she saw Barrett wasn't, "Save me," wasn't, "You came," wasn't anything he had expected. She asked, "Where's the dog? Is it okay?" Barrett froze. He looked at her. This woman who had just been kidnapped, locked inside a metal box, and had worn through her restraints with her bare hands. And the first thing she thought of wasn't herself. He stepped into the container, knelt beside Joe, gently took the metal cover from her hand, looked at her bruised, swollen wrists, and said softly, "It's still at home. It's waiting for you." Joe breathed out. Her shoulders sagged, and all the strength she had been holding for hours left her in a single breath. Barrett placed a hand on her shoulder, then held her. Gently, not tightly, not forcefully, just held her. For the first time in Barrett's life, he held someone not because of calculation, not because of duty, but because he needed to know she was still there. Joe leaned against his chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I knew you'd come, but I wasn't planning to just sit and wait." Barrett held her a little tighter. He said nothing. Outside the container, Slade knelt on the concrete, his head bowed low, knowing that from this moment on, his life had ended in a way he hadn't seen coming. The morning after the kidnapping, Barrett sat in the mansion's meeting room with the 4 guards who had taken part in rescuing Joe the night before. Slade was being held in a separate place, several kilometers away from the mansion, watched by Barrett's own men. The heads inside the Thornton network kept calling, asking how Barrett wanted to handle it, and what they meant was to handle it fast, handle it cleanly, in the way the underworld always dealt with traitors. Barrett didn't choose that way. He sat at the end of the table, looked at each face in the room, and said, "Close every door. From this moment on, no one in the Thornton network does business with Garrett Slade. No one takes his cargo. No one lends him money. No one gives him shelter. No one answers his calls. Anyone who takes him in shares the same outcome." The order spread within 1 hour. Barrett didn't need to call every allied family. He only needed to call 3 people, and those 3 people called 10 others, and those 10 called everyone who remained. That was Barrett Thornton's real power. It didn't lie in how many men he could knock down, but in how many doors he could close with a single sentence. Within 48 hours, Garrett Slade became a ghost. No family would take him in. No partner answered his calls. No hotel rented him a room. No driver gave him a ride. His bank accounts were frozen because of Thornton connections planted inside the financial system. Slade went from one city to another, knocking on door after door, and every door slammed shut in his face. One subordinate asked Barrett, "Why not just have someone finish him and be done with it?" Barrett was signing papers at his desk and didn't look up. "Let him run. Running when no one opens a door for you, that's real death." The subordinate fell silent, then walked out. From that day on, no one in the mansion mentioned Slade's name again. He became a man who didn't exist, alive as if already dead, walking down roads where not a single hand reached out to him. Barrett didn't need to stain his own hands. He only needed the world to know that if you betrayed Barrett Thornton, there wasn't a place on the map where you'd be safe. The Thornton mansion grew quiet again after Slade, but Joe didn't. The night she had been locked inside the container still followed her every time she closed her eyes. The smell of metal, the thick darkness, the cable cutting into her wrists. She didn't tell anyone, but she couldn't sleep. Her old habit returned more strongly than ever. Every night after 11 o'clock, she tossed and turned until she gave up, put on a coat, and walked around the mansion until morning. The mastiff always went with her, silently staying close to her legs, its sagging muzzle sweeping near the ground, its ears raised as it listened for every sound. One night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, Joe was walking down the back hallway of the mansion that led out to the garden. The mastiff suddenly stopped short. The fur along its neck rose. Its muzzle pointed toward the back corner of the yard. It let out a low growl, the kind Joe had heard only twice in her life, the last time on the night she found Barrett in the warehouse. Joe stopped, pulled the dog close, and listened. A small voice, very small, drifted from the dark corner behind the bushes near the wall. A subordinate was standing outside in the yard, his back turned to the mansion, one hand pressing a phone tightly to his ear, speaking quickly in a near whisper. Joe couldn't hear the words clearly, but as she walked past a few meters away from him, her nose caught something. Industrial machine oil. Not ordinary car engine oil, not the smell of grease in a garage. This was the smell of shipping container oil, the kind used to lubricate container door hinges and sliding rails. Thick and distinct. A smell only someone who worked every day at the docks would recognize. And Jo had smelled that scent very close, very clearly, in a situation she would never forget. The night she was locked up. When Sladesman opened the container door and threw her inside, she had smelled it on the hands of the man who grabbed her, on the shirt of the man who tied her, in the air when the door slammed shut. 7 years of driving night shifts had trained Jo's nose to tell the smell of truck diesel apart from ship engine oil, container lubricant, and passenger car motor oil. Her nose wasn't wrong. The subordinate secretly making a call in the backyard, the man Barrett's entire security team trusted, had container oil on him at 2 o'clock in the morning. Jo said nothing that night. She returned to her room, lay down on the bed, and closed her eyes. But her mind kept turning. The next morning, while Barrett sat alone drinking coffee in his study, Jo knocked on the door and stepped in. She sat across from him, her voice low. "Last night, I was walking in the backyard. The dog smelled something near the corner of the wall. There was someone making a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning." Barrett set his coffee cup down and looked at her. Jo continued, "I couldn't hear what he was saying, but when I passed by, I smelled container oil on him, the kind used to lubricate container door hinges at the port." She stopped and took a breath. "I smelled that exact same scent in the container the night I was locked inside, on the hands of the man who tied me. I'm not 100% sure, but that smell, I can't forget it." Barrett was silent. His eyes narrowed. He asked for the man's name, and Jo described where he had been standing and what he looked like. Barrett nodded, called in the head guard, and ordered an investigation. The result came within half a day. That subordinate was Slade's final man inside, planted in the mansion after the warehouse ambush, lying low for weeks and waiting for the chance to strike a second time. His phone contained messages with Slade's people outside. Barrett dealt with him immediately. Fast, clean, quietly. No one in the mansion knew what had happened except Barrett, Jo, and the head guard. That evening, Barrett found Jo in the backyard, where she was sitting on the steps feeding the dog. He stood beside her, looked down at her, and said, "The men I pay every month, the men who are professionally trained and fully equipped, not one of them caught it. You went for one sleepless walk in the yard and saw it." Jo didn't look up. She kept stroking the dog's head, her voice gentle. "I'm used to driving at night. Late at night, your ears have to be sharp, and your nose has to be good. If they weren't, I'd have driven a truck off the road a long time ago." Barrett looked at her for a few more seconds. This girl had no weapon, no power, no network at all. All she had was 7 years of driving night shifts, a nose sensitive to the smell of engine oil, and the survival instinct of someone used to living alone in the dark. And those things had just saved him from a danger that his entire elite security team had missed. Barrett turned and walked back into the house without saying anything more. But from that night on, when someone in the mansion asked who Jo was, the answer was no longer the woman Barrett brought home. The answer now was Barrett Thornton's person. Tiffany Braddock returned to the Thornton mansion 2 weeks after Barrett had threatened her. This time, she didn't come because she wanted to, but because her father, the boss of the Braddock family, had ordered her to bring business cooperation documents for Hank to sign. Tiffany entered the mansion through the side door, trying to avoid Barrett, but she ran into Jo in the first-floor hallway instead. Jo was sitting with a glass of water at the small table beside the window, the mastiff lying at her feet as usual. Tiffany stopped and looked at Jo. The last time, Barrett had threatened her in front of his men, and she had swallowed the humiliation and left. But over the past 2 weeks, that humiliation hadn't cooled. It had only boiled hotter. She looked around. There was no one in the hallway except 2 servants mopping the floor in the distance. Tiffany stepped closer to Jo, her voice low but clear enough. "I hear you're very cherished now. Everyone in the mansion has to bow their heads and greet you. But charity goods will always be charity goods. No matter how pretty a dress you wear, inside, you're still just that truck driver from the port." Jo set the glass of water down on the table, slowly, gently. Not a single drop spilled over the rim. She stood. The last time, when Tiffany had insulted her in front of Barrett's men, Jo had silently stood up and walked away. That time, she hadn't been ready. She hadn't yet believed she had the right to open her mouth in this house. But from that night until now, Jo had been locked in a container, had worn through a cable restraint with her bare hands, had uncovered the inside man Barrett's entire security team had missed. She was no longer the girl who lowered her head and walked away. Joe looked straight into Tiffany's eyes. She didn't shout. She didn't tremble. Her voice was so calm that the two servants in the distance stopped mopping and listened. "The night Barrett was badly wounded at the port. Where were you?" Tiffany blinked. Joe continued, still with that same voice, still with that same gaze. "The night I was locked inside a container. Where were you? You call me charity goods, but I haven't seen you give anything except cruel words." Tiffany stood frozen, her mouth opened, but no words came past her lips. The two servants in the distance lowered their faces toward the floor, hiding their smiles. Joe looked at Tiffany for one more second, then turned and walked away. Not rushing, not running, her back straight, her steps steady. She had said what needed to be said. This time, she didn't need Barrett to stand up and protect her. She protected herself. That afternoon, Barrett was at the Eastern Port dealing with the aftermath of Slade's betrayal, rearranging personnel and shipping routes. Only Hank, a few servants, and Joe remained at the mansion. Hank sat in his second-floor study, reviewing the documents Tiffany had brought. He was 62 years old, and his health had declined since Barrett was attacked. Night after sleepless night, and the pressure of handling the internal crisis wore his body down day by day. No one knew exactly what time it happened. They only knew that a servant passing by the study heard a heavy thud, opened the door, and saw Hank lying on the floor. His face was turning bluish-purple, one side of his mouth sagging, his right arm hanging limp and motionless, his eyes open but panicked. The servant screamed. 2 more servants ran in. All 3 stood around Hank, trembling, and none of them knew what to do. One called the family doctor, and was told the doctor was on the other side of the city and would need at least 30 minutes. One called emergency services, and the dispatcher told them to wait. The other knelt beside Hank, shook his shoulder, and kept calling his name, doing exactly the wrong thing to do with someone having a stroke. Joe heard the scream from downstairs. She ran up the stairs, rushed into the study, saw Hank on the floor, saw the 3 panicked servants, and assessed the situation in 2 seconds. "Step back." Joe's voice was sharp and firm, not asking permission. The 3 servants stepped back. Joe knelt beside Hank. She gently turned him into a recovery position on his side, his head tilted slightly back to keep the airway open, exactly the position she had learned in the mandatory first aid course for heavy-duty drivers. She loosened his tie, unbuttoned the collar of his shirt, and checked his breathing. He was still breathing, but shallowly and unevenly. His eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling, full of fear. Hank Thornton, the man the entire Redmore underworld called Boss, the man who had built an empire from nothing, was lying on the floor of his own home, unable to move half his body, and terrified of dying. His lips moved, trying to say something, but only broken sounds came out. Joe held his hand. Her hand was calloused, large, rough, the hand of a truck driver who had spent 7 years pulling chains and turning bolts. That hand held Hank's hand, firm, warm, and it didn't let go. "Look at me," Joe said, her voice clear and slow, enough for Hank to focus on. "You're not allowed to close your eyes. The doctor's coming. Look at me and breathe with me." Hank looked at her. His eyes, once sharp as knives, were now trembling and wet. He looked at the girl he had once ordered locked in the basement for 4 days without food or water. The girl he had judged as a suspect without needing to hear an explanation. And that girl was kneeling on the floor, holding his hand, keeping him awake, keeping him alive. Until the doctor arrived. Joe held Hank's hand for the entire 30 minutes. She didn't leave, didn't stand up, didn't let go, even though her knees ached from kneeling too long on the hard stone floor. She kept talking to him, her voice steady and slow, telling him nonsense things, just so he would have a human voice to hold on to. When the doctor arrived, Hank was still conscious, still breathing, still looking at Joe. The doctor said that if they had been 10 minutes later, or if no one had kept him in the proper position, everything could have turned out differently. Hank stayed in his private room at the mansion for a week after that. Barrett returned as soon as he heard the news and stayed by his father's side. But Hank didn't call Barrett in for the first conversation. He called Joe. Joe entered the room and stood beside his bed. Hank looked at her, his voice weak from the crisis he had just survived, but every word clear. "I locked you in the basement. 4 days. No food, no water. and yet you still held my hand when I was about to die." Joe looked at him, not angry, not triumphant, not bringing up the past again. She only said gently, "Because I know what it feels like to lie there alone with no one holding your hand." Hank closed his eyes. A tear ran down his temple, then soaked into the pillow. He said nothing more. Joe said nothing more either. She turned and walked out, gently closing the door behind her. 2 weeks after Hank survived the stroke, Barrett called a meeting of every leader in the Thornton network. It wasn't a regular meeting. Barrett called each man by name and required them to be present, with no absences accepted. 13 men sat around the long oak table in the meeting room on the top floor of the Thornton building, the same room where, a few months earlier, Morris had knelt on the floor begging for more time to pay his debt. Hank sat in the chairman's seat at the head of the table, his health still weak, one hand still not moving fully, but he insisted on being there. Barrett stood at the opposite end of the table from his father, both hands resting on the tabletop, looking at each face in the room one by one. Then he spoke, his voice even and clear, with no winding introduction. "I'm going to marry Jolene Calloway." The meeting room stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then it erupted, not with shouting, but with murmurs, chairs scraping, sharp breaths being drawn in, pens being set down hard on the table. An older leader seated near Hank spoke first, trying to keep his voice calm but unable to hide his displeasure. "Barrett, are you serious? Who is she? No family background, no origin worth naming, no beauty, nothing at all. You're the head of the Thornton family. Your marriage has to carry strategic meaning." Another man followed. "The Braddock family has had an arrangement in place for a long time. Tiffany Braddock is the reasonable choice. That marriage keeps the alliance intact, keeps things stable. What does that truck-driving girl bring us?" A third man added, "How do you think the allied families will react when they hear that the head of Thornton is marrying some cargo girl from the docks?" Barrett stood still and let them speak. He let every objection spread across the table like cards turned face up in a gamble. He didn't interrupt, didn't frown, didn't show anything at all. When the last man finished, the room settled, and every eye turned toward Barrett, waiting for him to refute them with reason or persuade them with benefit. Barrett did neither. He took off his suit jacket and laid it over the back of the chair. Then he pulled his shirt free from his waistband, gripped the right side of the fabric, and lifted it. A long scar ran across his right side, from his 5th rib down near his hip, pale pink new skin surrounding it, not fully healed yet, still raised beneath the meeting room lights. 13 men looked at that scar. The room was so quiet they could hear the wall clock ticking. Barrett let his shirt fall back down and looked at each face slowly, from left to right, missing no one. Then he said, "This scar, that night, I was attacked in the Eastern Warehouse District. Slade betrayed me. 2 guards turned their backs. I was lying on a warehouse floor, alone, in the middle of the night." He paused. "Not one person in this room came looking for me. Silence. No one moved." Barrett continued, his voice still even, but every word heavier than the one before it. "She did. The night shift truck driver, the woman you call nothing at all. She drove past the warehouse, found me, gave me first aid with cargo straps, dragged me outside in the rain, and took me back to her home. She put me on her own bed, sat on the floor, and watched over me all night, counting each breath I took until morning came." He looked at the older leader who had objected first. "You said she brings nothing. She brought back my life." Then Barrett turned to Hank. His father had sat silent from the beginning of the meeting, his eyes lowered to the table, his weak right hand resting on his thigh. Barrett said, his voice unchanged, though something heavier hid behind it. "You locked her in the basement for 4 days. No food, no water. She nearly died because she saved your son." He paused for one beat. "And yet when you fell ill, when you collapsed on the floor of your study and no one knew what to do, when the servants stood trembling around you, she was the one who ran in. She put you in the right position. She loosened your tie. She held your hand for 30 minutes until the doctor arrived." Barrett looked straight into Hank's eyes. "She held the hand of the man who had locked her away, and she didn't ask a single question about the past." The meeting room went dead still. Not one breath, not one movement. The 13 most powerful men in Redmore sat there, and not one of them could open his mouth, because there was no argument that could refute the truth standing in front of them. Hank looked down at his right hand, the weak hand, almost unable to move, the hand Joe had held tightly for 30 minutes on the floor of his study 2 weeks earlier. when he thought he was about to die. He remembered Joe's hand, rough, calloused, large, gripping firmly enough that he could feel each of her fingers pressing into his skin, and he had clung to that hand as if clinging to life itself. He remembered her voice. "Look at me. You're not allowed to close your eyes." And he remembered what she had said after he recovered. "Because I know what it feels like to lie there alone with no one holding your hand." Hank placed his left hand on the tabletop and slowly pushed himself to his feet. Slowly, with difficulty, but he stood. The whole room looked at him. Hank looked at Barrett, then swept his gaze across the 12 faces around the table, and said, his voice deep and slowed by poor health, but every word clear, "Jolene Calloway is worth more than many people sitting in this room." The meeting room seemed to tremble in silence. That wasn't the statement of a father accepting his future daughter-in-law. That was the statement of Hank Thornton, the founding boss of the Thornton Empire, a man whose every word in this room carried the weight of law, and he had just declared that a fat, poor truck driver with no family name was worth more than the bosses seated around the table. No one objected. No one dared. Barrett looked at his father, gave a slight nod, then turned to the leaders and spoke the final sentence of the meeting. "If kindness like hers isn't enough to enter this family, then this family doesn't deserve her, not the other way around." He took his suit jacket from the back of the chair, put it on, buttoned it, and walked out of the room. He didn't wait for a vote. He didn't wait for agreement, because it wasn't a question. It was an announcement. Behind him, 13 men remained seated in the meeting room, silent, looking at one another, and not one of them said another word. The wedding took place on a late autumn day, when the afternoon sunlight laid a warm golden layer over the Thornton mansion. The garden behind the mansion was decorated with white flowers and small lights arranged along the aisle. White chairs were lined up across the lawn, every row filled. Leaders, allies, partners, all the most powerful faces in Redmore were present, including the men who, only a few weeks earlier, had sat in the meeting room and opposed this marriage. They came not because they had changed their minds, but because no one dared be absent from Barrett Thornton's wedding. On the second floor of the mansion, in the room where, only a few months earlier, she had refused to sit in the leather chair because she was afraid of getting it dirty, Joe stood alone in front of the mirror. A white wedding dress, simple, with no gemstones, no elaborate lace. For the first time in the 27 years of her life, Jolene Calloway wore a dress. She looked at herself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. Then she looked down at her hands. 2 calloused hands, nails cut short, thick scars of hard skin across her palms, from 7 years of gripping a truck steering wheel, and on her right wrist, the faint scar still left from the night she wore through the cable inside the container. These hands had pulled chains, tightened bolts, lifted cargo boxes, given first aid to 2 Thornton men, and worn through restraints with an iron bar in the dark. These hands had never been held by anyone for more than a few seconds, not until Barrett held them in the container that night. Joe opened the old wallet she had carried with her for 7 years, brown leather, worn at the corners, the stitching along the edge already coming loose. Inside, there was only one thing: her parents' wedding photograph. The picture had faded, its corner slightly curled, but it was still clear. Her mother wore a white dress and smiled brightly, her hair pinned up. Her father stood beside her, one arm around her mother's waist, his face a little red because he was shy about being photographed, young and happy. Both of them were no longer in this world. Joe placed her finger on the photograph, touching her mother's face, then her father's face. She didn't say anything. She didn't whisper, didn't call their names, didn't make any promises. She only stood there, her hand resting on the picture, and cried. Tears fell onto the photograph, then ran over her fingers, then dropped onto the white dress. She cried without a sound, her shoulders trembling slightly, her mouth pressed tight, the way she had cried every time in her life, alone, with no one hearing her. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, folded the photograph carefully, slipped it back into her wallet, and tucked the wallet into the small inner pocket of her wedding dress, taking her parents with her. There was a soft knock on the door. A servant told her it was time. Joe drew a long breath, lifted her head, and stepped out of the room. She walked down the second-floor hallway, descended the grand staircase, and went out through the back door leading to the garden. And when she stepped into the afternoon sunlight, hundreds of people turned to look. Leaders, allies, servants, guards, all of them, They watched the girl no one had known by name only a few months earlier. The night shift truck driver from the poor neighborhood near the port, walking among them in a white dress. And beside her, not a bridesmaid, not a relative, but the ugly, wrinkled-faced Neapolitan mastiff, a white bow tied around its neck, walking steadily beside her feet, as if it had practiced this aisle all its life. A few people among the guests let out quiet laughs. A few others smiled. The old cook stood behind the rows of chairs, dabbing her eyes with a cloth. Barrett waited at the end of the aisle beneath the arch of white flowers. He watched Joe walk toward him, watched the dog beside her, watched her calloused hand clutch the small bouquet, and his eyes didn't leave her for even half a second. When Joe stood before Barrett, the mastiff sat down beside her feet, its sagging muzzle lifted as it looked at the two of them, as if it understood something important was happening. Barrett took Joe's hand. His hand was large, wrapping fully around her rough one. He said nothing beyond the words required for the ceremony. But the way he held her hand, tight, firm, without letting go, said more than any speech ever could. Hank sat in the first row, his right hand still weak on his lap, his eyes fixed on his son and the girl standing beneath the flower arch. He didn't say anything. He only nodded once, lightly, when Barrett put the ring on Joe's finger. Outside the mansion gate, separated from the wedding by a high wall and 2 iron gates, Wesley Greer stood on the sidewalk across the street, looking in. He hadn't been invited. He had no reason to be here. But he came. He stood there, his hands tucked in his pants pockets, looking through the bars of the iron gate at Joe, in her white dress, walking among the most powerful people in the city, the ugly dog beside her, and Barrett Thornton holding her hand at the end of the aisle, the girl he had once loved, the girl he hadn't dared to keep. Wesley stood watching for a few more seconds, then turned and walked away. No one at the wedding realized he had come. No one realized he had left. After the wedding, Joe didn't turn into someone else. She still woke early, still made her own coffee, still rolled up her sleeves and helped the old cook whenever she had free time. But now she had resources she had never dared dream of before, and she used those resources for exactly one thing: helping people who were like the person she used to be. Joe persuaded Barrett to open a support fund for the homeless in the Redmore Port District, the place she used to drive through every night and see people curled beneath warehouse awnings. The fund didn't only hand out meals or warm blankets. Joe opened free vocational classes for young adults in the Port District, teaching them how to drive, how to repair engines, how to give first aid, the things she had once been forced to learn alone because there had been no one to show her. She taught the classes herself every week, her hands still calloused, her voice still low, still blunt, and without empty words. The students called her Miss Joe, not Mrs. Thornton. She liked that better. Barrett stood outside, watching his wife among a group of young adults struggling to open a car hood, their hands smeared with oil, laughing and talking freely. He said nothing. He only watched. And in the eyes of the most powerful boss of the Eastern Port, there was something softer than anyone had ever seen in him before. One weekend afternoon, after the vocational class ended and all the students had gone home, Joe sat on the mansion porch, looking out toward the port in the distance. The late afternoon sun covered the sea in a layer of orange gold. The sea breeze blew gently, carrying the smell of salt and the familiar scent of engine oil that she had breathed in through 7 years of driving night shifts. The Neapolitan mastiff lay stretched out at her feet. It was no longer thin and bony like the day it had curled beside the trash bin at the dock. Its fur was smoother now, its body fuller, its round, well-fed belly touching the porch floor when it lay down, but its face was still the same, still wrinkled, still sagging at the muzzle, still looking at the world with those sorrowful eyes and that quietly affectionate indifference. Ugly, by the way the whole world judged things, but loyal, in a way no one could deny. Joe stroked its big, heavy head, her calloused fingers moving over the folds of wrinkled skin between its ears. The dog closed its eyes, its tail gently thumping against the porch floor. Joe spoke softly, her voice as light as the evening wind. "You see that? We're okay now." Jolene Calloway's story wasn't a fairy tale. No miracle turned her into someone else. She was still herself, her hands still calloused, her wallet still holding the old photograph, and the ugly dog still walking beside her. But maybe that was the most important thing of all. Sometimes, the person the world looks down on is the very person most willing to give. Appearance never tells the whole story of a human life. And real strength doesn't lie in looks or power, but in the ability to walk through pain and still keep kindness intact. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with the people you think need to hear it. If this is your first time visiting our channel, please subscribe so you don't miss the next stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below and share what's in the deepest part of your heart. We always read and listen to every line. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.